Okay, thanks, Sheila. So welcome everyone tonight. This is a Labour Housing Group event. So we're a socialist society. We're affiliated to the Labour Party, trying to influence Labour Party housing policy. Our big push at the moment is around housing as a human right. If you're not already a member, we'd obviously encourage you to go on our website and join us. Janet, sorry I'm late with my subs, but I'm going to pay, honestly. Okay, so what we've discovered through Zoom is it's a way of getting some of the country's leading thinkers about housing to come along and talk to us. And obviously we're delighted to have Mercy and Amanze tonight, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. So stigma and social housing, really big issue. Narrative matters. We're delighted that our shadow spokesperson, Lisa Nande, is taking a really strong line on this. So her line is that the security and affordability of council housing is critical to families living decent lives and achieving their potential. And also she's very clear that having housing that's collectively and locally owned is a really great thing. So Lisa's establishing a clear narrative for us. We're going to develop that tonight with Dr. Mercy Denedo. Hopefully I've got your name right, but if I haven't, you can correct me, from Durham University, and Dr. Amanze Ejiogu from Newcastle University. They produced a report which some of you might have caught into stigma and social housing. They're going to be talking about their conclusion that follows on from the last In Conversation event we had with Marion Hood, and it's around giving council tenants or secure tenants a voice. So format we're going to follow tonight is that Mercy and Amanze are going to talk for about 20 minutes, and then, especially if it's a small group, we can be nice and informal and just jump in with questions. So Mercy, Amanze, who's going to start?
I think I'll start. Thanks, Andy, for the introduction, and thanks for having Mercy and I over tonight. We're really delighted to be able to talk about our work. So Mercy and I, sometime about 2018, started looking at stigma in social housing. Mercy had been involved with human rights activists groups, and I had been involved in social housing for a while. And so we started looking at stigma in social housing. Our kind of key objectives when we set out was to look at how social housing came to be stigmatized. So who were the key players? How did they contribute to constructing the stigma around social housing? How were the tenants experiencing this stigma? What impact was it having on them? And what were the things being done to challenge stigma in social housing? So that's kind of what we set out to look at. What we did was we did a documentary analysis looking at historical archives and documents around social housing and housing policy going back to, say, about the early 1900s. We also conducted a set of interviews and focus groups kind of around all the regions in England. Overall, we talked to over 200 people spread across the regions, and mix of tenants, housing landlords, so housing associations, almos, councils, and then other stakeholder groups, NatFeds, the kind of TPAs, Chartered Institute of Housing. So a broad range of people we spoke with. And then we also looked at social media and what was going on on social media. So that's kind of what we did. So what did we find? Basically, pre-1970, we saw a more social housing being more accepted in society. We saw people being proud of being of getting a house. Then it was called public housing, and you had a wider range of people living in housing. By 1969, over a third of the population was in public housing. But gradually, you started to have this negative narrative start to creep in. These were people getting things on the cheap, subsidized housing. There were things around building and construction and kind of planning for some of the estates, which, the open spaces weren't completely thought out properly. And so antisocial behavior and things like that started to be associated with some of those estates. Well, post 1970, we started seeing a more intense stigmatization of social housing, a lot of it driven by political rhetoric, by kind of housing policy, rights to buy, residualization of housing, the push towards home ownership. And then from the kind of 2010 with the austerity, kind of policies, we saw a much more intense stigmatization of social housing. And a lot of it was around trying to justify changes in the welfare system. And broadly, it was a wider stigmatization of the poor, but a lot of that congregated in social housing. So, and then you started to see things like benefit streets, the media picking it up. You had programs like benefit streets and things. So the media amplified that kind of stigmatization. But we also saw stigmatization from, if you like, within the sector. So from the landlords themselves, we saw paternalistic attitudes. We saw landlords not listening to tenants, being disrespectful. And all of this was happening in the context where the tenants had become increasingly marginalized. There wasn't a strong tenant voice at any level, local, regional, or national. So there wasn't that sense of the tenants being involved in shaping policy or governance at the more local level. We saw a complex picture, intersectionality with other forms of stigma, so drugs and crime, mental health, poverty, class, race, all of those stigmas kind of congregated in the social housing space also. And so it's difficult to talk about social housing stigma without talking about these other associated stigmas. That being said, we saw regional variations. In the north, we saw, much more acceptance of social housing. In the bigger, densely populated urban areas, London, for instance, we saw more intense stigmatization. And again, between generations, we saw, the older generation who had seen public housing pre the 70s had a different view of social housing from the younger generations. Mercy, if you go on. We also, in terms of experience, people talked about their experiences, with their landlords and the disrespectful behavior. We had people telling us their landlords were telling them they were lucky to be in social housing, and so they should accept whatever kind of service was being given. We saw people talk about differential policing. We saw people talking about postcode stigma, not being going for job interviews and being told because you live in that estate or in that area, you're not going to get this job. You need to move somewhere else. We saw people talk about, teachers telling them they won't amount to anything because they lived in social housing. In London, we saw the kind of segregated housing and poor doors. So we had, quite a broad view of the different ways in which stigma impacted on the people and was experienced by them. We also saw kind of things people were trying to do to challenge stigma. In London, we saw artists come together to put up an art exhibition and protests around poor doors. We saw on social media organizations like what used to be Benefits to Society, renamed See the Person, and now Stop the Stigma, Stop Social Housing Stigma campaign, put out positive narrative stories, or about social housing in the media. With the CIH, they developed a kind of fair press guide for the media to, kind of direct their engagement with social housing. The government has tried to say, well, stigma and things around stigma are really a planning issue, and if we, have these mixed tenure estates, then things will sort themselves out. But what we found was even on those mixed tenure estates, there was intense stigmatization going on. The landlords, on the other hand, have kind of been saying, well, this is more a training issue and we'll give more training to the staff. And again, that hasn't helped very much. So by the time we finished that kind of phase of the study, we thought, instead of making recommendations, let's try to open up the space around, or the conversation around, stigma. And so we put out a consultation, public consultation, and we got quite a number of responses to that. But the kind of questions we put out to consultation, I think went to the root issues of stigma. And broadly, the first kind of two questions around what the purpose of social housing should be, and whether we should, instead of the approach being taken now, look at housing as, or affordable housing as, a fundamental right and take a rights-based approach towards housing. Second set of questions around what can be done to change the stigmatizing narrative from the politicians and policymakers and from the media. And then third set of questions around how do we empower the tenants? How do we change the power imbalance between landlords and tenants? So how do we create this strong voice for tenants? How do we make landlords more accountable to tenants? So those were the questions which went out to consultation, and I'll pass it on to Mercy to speak about the responses from the consultation. Mercy, you're mute.
Hi, thanks. So from the consultation, we had the consultation last year, and based on the findings from the consultation, we published another report in September titled Stigma and Social Housing in England, Feedback on the Consultation Responses. So I will just quickly walk through the feedback from it and the recommendations from it. So the responses we got, we had 11 focus group conversations with policymakers, councillors, housing providers, board members, CEOs, and frontline staff, including social housing tenants, social housing campaigners. Also, the Housing Association, they also organized focus group on our behalf, and some of them, they invited us to engage in the focus group conversation. 4 of the housing providers converted the consultation questions, the 7 questions, into survey, and they sent it out to their staff, the tenants, their partners, in this case, the police, their contractors, and so on. So from the 4 housing association, we got 149 responses. 103 were from the tenants, 37 were from the housing professionals, and 9 were from the other partners, the police, the contractors, and so on. Then we got 6 individual submissions from the tenants. We got 6 individual submissions from the housing providers, and from the housing providers, the large, the medium-sized housing providers. And we got 3 feedback from the professional trade bodies like CIH, NAFED, National Federation of Almost. They've published their responses. So if you want to see what they publish, it's online, you can go and access it. Then we got 1 from the local authorities. So the first question is, what should the purpose of social housing be? Majority of those that responded said social housing should be for everyone. It should be accessible by all, and it should provide decent and affordable accommodation for all, regardless of their status in the society, whether they are rich, they are poor, or they are migrant. As long as they choose to live in social housing, they should be able to access it. And it should offer secure tenancy to those on low incomes, those seeking works, immigrants, and so on. And if we have to do that, it means there's a need for substantial investment in building more quality social homes for all. Then the second one is based on the question around affordability of housing being seen as a human right. And majority of the responses we got said housing should be seen as human right, particularly in England. Is not a conversation that is currently ongoing, but in Scotland, they've had a conversation on whether housing should be seen as human right. And even the Scottish government, they published a note in response to how they want to see their housing policy going forward. But in England, there's no concrete evidence to show that the government, they are moving towards that direction. And if we have to tackle stigma, housing should be seen as a human right. And if housing is seen as a human right, it means everyone should have access to decent accommodation, affordable accommodation. And to tackle stigma, affordability of housing should be at the core of government policy. And in this case, everyone should be able to afford social homes, regardless of their level of income. So the government housing policy should ensure that whatsoever they are providing, it should meet different level of affordability. And they also talked about, and in relation to tackling stigma, many believe that if we have more people who can afford to own their own home, also choose to live in social housing, that will help tackle the stigma in social housing. And many also feel that if we have to see housing as a human right, then all the conversation around home ownership need to be tackled, because it means they are projecting home ownership as a superior tenure to social housing. So if we have to see housing as a human right, the conversation around home ownership needs to be minimized. What the government needs to be having is around conversation around providing homes, regardless of whether they are for sale or for social homes. That will help tackle stigma. Also, they talked about the fact that if we see housing as a human right, all the complex stigma like drugs, like poverty, unemployment, and disability, race would be tackled if housing is seen as a human right, because whatsoever policy they are introducing, they have to introduce an holistic policy that will help them to tackle all these intersecting stigmas. And in so doing, the government, they need to invest more in social housing. The right to buy initiative, particularly in England, majority felt if we are going towards that direction of housing being seen as a human right, the right to buy policy needs to be withdrawn, because majority of the receipts from the right to buy policy, they've not been reinvested in providing more quality homes. So the only way we can ensure that those that need social homes have access to it is if we stop the right to buy agenda and government then invest more in social housing. Then the third question is around how to challenge political rhetoric around stigma. And what we found is that there was a very clear connection between the political rhetoric and the media rhetoric. Majority felt that because the way government projects social housing as an inferior tenure, then the media, they then capitalize on it and then use that narrative to stigmatize social housing. So to tackle that, majority felt the government, they need to set the right tone and project social housing as a tenure of choice for everyone. Then they need to ensure that the media, they pick up on that. And when the politicians, they are justifying their housing policy, they need to stop narrative around housing being seen, social housing being seen as home ownership being seen as something that everyone should aspire to, and social housing being seen as a residualized tenure. That if we are able to change those rhetoric around that narrative around home ownership, social housing, that will help address stigma. Also, majority talked about the need for the government to adopt a collaborative approach towards tackling stigma. In this case, working together with their at the local level, working with the housing providers, attending tenant forum to understand how social housing tenants want to be portrayed by the policy makers, how the media should portray them. If they are more involved with decision making, how things are run at the local level, they will understand why there's a need for more social housing to be built and how they will need to portray that in their policies. And also, majority talked about the need for the tenant to adopt the Fair Price for Tenant Guide, which was produced by CIH in collaboration with the city person, because in that guide they produced, in that report, they provided guidelines on how social housing tenants want to be portrayed and how the media need to portray them. Also, majority talked about the need for the housing providers to publicize positive stories around social housing, because majority of the stories are internally disseminated. They don't go outside the organization. Majority felt if those information, those positive stories are publicized, that will also help shape political rhetoric around social housing and then help challenge the stigma. Then the fifth question is, how can we create a stronger and more effective tenant voice at the local and national levels? Based on our initial report, even on the consultation report, majority felt at the national level, there needs to be a national tenant body representing and speaking on behalf of the tenants. Currently, we don't have that body. And because of that, there's a power imbalance between the regulator and the landlord, because within the regulatory space, there's no place for tenant to fit in. The relationship is currently between the regulator and the tenant. So majority felt at the national level, at the central level, tenants need to be part and parcel of the decision-making process. They need to have a national tenants body that will speak on behalf of the tenants and that will challenge the government when they use their stigmatizing rhetoric, and even when they're trying to introduce welfare initiatives that will affect social housing tenants or that will affect the housing stock. You have this body that will help speak on behalf of the tenants. Also, at the local level, majority felt the tenants should be part of the system at the local level. They should be board members. They should be, tenants panel members. They should have a voice at the local level. They should be able to speak to their housing providers, because what we found is that most housing providers, even when they say they listen to their tenants, when you speak to the tenant, they felt that their housing providers, they don't listen to them, which means there's a distinction between you actually listening and you acting. So most housing providers, they will tell you, we are listening, we are doing this, we are doing that. When we spoke to the tenant, they're like, no, they're not doing this. Even when they pretend to be listening, they just don't pay attention, they ignore us and so on. So from the consultation, majority felt there's a need for them to be involved at the local level, so that when they are speaking at the board level, they are part of the system, they understand the system, and they're able to influence decision makings as well. And at the regional level, there needs to be a regional voice speaking at the regional level as well. Also, majority felt at the local level, policymakers, they need to be part of the tenants forum, that most housing providers, they have tenants forum, and you have either councillors or MPs within that region. They should understand that whenever the tenant forums they meet, the MPs and so on, they should find time to attend those forums to understand the issues being faced by social housing tenants, and that will help them to influence policy at the central level. Then the sixth one is, how can we make social housing providers more accountable to tenants? Majority talked about the need for them to have a democratic accountability system, which will place tenants at the core of any decision making, and they should be part of the decision making process. And there's a need to ensure that performance is tied to compensation. When performance is tied to compensation, it means that will influence service delivery, and the tenant, they will be able to challenge the housing providers when service delivery is not at an acceptable level. Majority also talked about the need to have a stronger legislation that will compel housing providers to be accountable to their tenants, that will ensure that the tenant, they also have power to influence policies, and they are part of the regulatory body within the sector. So they are co-regulator of the sector. Then the last question is, how can we build a sustainable and inclusive social housing system? All the feedback said is a combination of all the previous 6 initiatives. And one thing they also mentioned is that social housing tenants, they also need to take pride in their homes, and the government, they need to invest more in social housing, withdrawal of the right to buy. And one other thing they mentioned within this space is that if we have to tackle social housing stigma, we also need to ensure that the mission drift of most housing providers, where you have some large housing providers, their emphasis is on making profit rather than providing services, that we need to tackle that problem. We need to understand that there should be a limit to size. And because most of those large housing providers, they've lost touch, they don't provide effective customer service. And most times when you look at the media, you have some negative reports around, like the majority made reference to the ITN expose, where they talked about disrepair complaints and tenants being ignored and so on. Majority link that to size, and to tackle stigma, particularly as it relates to the housing provider, we need to address the problem of size here. Also, majority talked about if we are to tackle antisocial behaviors, domestic abuse, which is also linked to housing being a right. All the agencies have to collaborate together, including local authorities, the housing providers, the police, and so on, to tackle antisocial behavior. So I will hand over to Amanze so that I can then conclude. Thank you.
Just a kind of couple of slides to draw thoughts together. I think the recent inquiry by the House Leveling Up committee was welcome, and one of the things which they picked up on was stigma, and part of what they were saying in their report was the need for diversity of voices in the governance structures of housing providers. But in terms of where we want this to go, I think we've framed a couple of questions, or kind of to shape our thinking. We need to do things to change the narrative. Some of the responses from the consultation talk about that we need to create this system of accountability to tenants, but also we need to think about how we can direct investment to building the kind of social infrastructure which is needed in those communities where you have the social housing estates. How do we direct investments to grow the housing stock substantially? Because a lot of the issue is, I mean, with the residue, there's a lot of pressure on the housing stock, and waiting lists are, very big. So how do we grow that stock? And I think as we begin to address these things, stigma gets addressed because there's more social acceptance, social housing. But also we need to develop that more localized understanding of stigma. The things around tenant voice. Yes, we need a national tenant organization, national tenant voice, but such an organization needs to be autonomous. So it cannot be set up by the National Housing Federation. They've tried to do that, but you cannot really have a strong voice for tenants which sits with them. There will be issues around funding, resourcing of that kind of body. There will be issues around how do we drive participation, and who are the tenants, who will be the representatives. But those are discussions which we need to have to put that. And to do that, I think there needs to be some significant support from government. Not necessarily funding. I think there are other ways of working out the funding without the government putting money into it, but we need those kind of structures. There needs to be stronger tenant participation in regulation, especially around setting standards for service delivery and assessing whether those standards have been met. So, I mean, if we go back to kind of the key lines of inquiry, many moons ago, where you had tenants involved in the regulatory inspection of the housing providers, we need some sort of system which puts the tenants back at some power back in the hands of tenants. We need to then also ensure that the housing associations are operated for the benefit of tenants with the tenants' interests as the key focus, as opposed to the commercial drive. One of the things which we've seen is, as the housing associations have grown larger, there's been a more significant disconnect from the communities they serve. And so we need to, and I mean, we are still talking about mergers of associations. We need to be thinking about how do we ensure that they don't grow too large and keep rooted in communities. So I think those are kind of thoughts which we are, putting out, and I'll stop there and, kind of open it up to discussion.
Yeah, but thanks, Amanze and Mercy. That was brilliant. Can I go over to John Lynch for a question, please?
Oh, yeah, thank you to you both. I mean, that was really, really interesting. You do very important research. Have you looked at the TMO model in your studies at all, the tenant managed organisations?
We looked at ALMOs. So ALMOs were part of the study, but not the more TMOs.
I think it would be really, really helpful. I mean, it's very much bottom up rather than top down with housing associations. I'm one of the resident directors of the Leather Market Joint Management Board, and Andy's the manager. I mean, Andy's managed the J&B for about 25 years. So I'm sure if anything, if you want any questions or any research, I mean, I'm sure we'll be more than happy to help.
Yeah, I think two kind of places we still need to look at are the kind of the TMOs and the kind of cooperative housing providers. I think those are kind of things we're going to look at.
I mean, regarding getting a voice, we do. It's very much resident-led, and with other organisations, I've been in meetings where there's been representatives from housing organisations, and they don't. Or it'd be very, very unusual if they do. I mean, all what you said was really interesting and brilliant and very true. They're getting bigger and bigger, housing organisations, and residents are sort of getting left behind. Their voices are. I mean, that's really excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I just come in with a question behind what John said in terms of stigma? So I've worked in council housing for about 40 years, and I can't think of any estate in London of any size where there's not some people trying to change it. So from John's example, people here have got a kind of £7 million operating budget. They've built 69 new council homes in the last 4 years or so. So kind of big responsibility. To other people on other estates who might be running a bingo club or giving some welfare rights advice. So there's all these things happening on council estates that don't get publicised as part of the follow-up on the research. Do you think there might be a way of kind of picking up on these positive stories?
I think with the council, again, what we saw was variability with some of the councils, but yes, there's a lot of taking pride, or tenants, residents doing things to improve the estates. A lot of participation. But the other side of it, which we saw, was a squeezing of budgets, which meant that some of the services, which, you know, some of the kind of, even just take the kind of community meeting spaces which some of those estates used to have been, you know, withdrawn, or, you know, and so with the squeezing of the budgets, with the tenants find it more and more difficult to run some of those things. But yes, I think there's, you know, that's part of what I think we've been saying in terms of more of those positive stories need to go out, and people need to see that positive side of social housing.
Yeah,
I mean, with one of the people we interviewed, they are more interested in the negative stories. And sometimes they want a story, they come and they pay people to act disruptive so they can film them and present a negative story. So part of that is, you know, how do we get the media to you know, put those positive stories out?
yeah. I think within that space, well, if we was it not yesterday or today? Yesterday we have a piece on published by CIH, and it's something that we also highlighted within that piece, that there needs to be a collaborative platform where all the key stakeholders like NAFED, the CIH, the National Federation of Almost, they can publicize those positive stories, because what we observe is most of those positive stories, they are publicized internally. It doesn't get out of the organization. And so those of us who are not social housing tenants, we don't get to know what is going on within that space. And if we have to challenge stigma, those positive stories, they need to leave the housing association level. They need to get out to the society and let us know what is going on there. So I think to do that, there needs to be like a collaboration between NAFED, CIH, and the regulators and so on to publicize those information. We did discuss that in one of the CIH blogs, that they need to do that to engage more.
Thank you. Kerry?
Can I join in with a thanks for your research, but can I promote some what might be thought as being quite radical views? I'm like most of the baby boomers. I was brought up in council houses, a prefab and then a pre-war council estate, like Starmer and people like that. And the right to buy, introduced by Thatcher, destroyed council estates. But we haven't, as a Labour Party, haven't done anything to change that. Don't we need to make sure it becomes policy of the party to reintroduce the right to councils to build houses and get rid of the right to buy? I mean, I joined a meeting, I think in July, of the association, when we had that research from Australia, which showed that over 50% of the right to buy properties are finished up in the hands of private landlords, which is a disgraceful situation. And the model of accountability set in local authorities was dissipated by removing them into housing associations. And so we've got to stop that too. But we've got to make it party policy, have we not, to actually reintroduce council houses properly funded and with councils being properly accountable. And then I agree with all the points about tenant representation, etc., but that used to be done in the councils when I was a boy growing up. And I think we've got to be much bolder about this. I think trying to persuade media such as the Daily Mail to prevent a positive view of social housing is a hopeless task. Thanks for that rant.
So Mercy and Amanze, do you want to come in, and then we'll go over to Sheila?
Yeah, I think with the right to buy, that's funny enough, we had a conversation with one MP today around the right to buy, a conservative MP, and from the conversation, what we got was, because being a conservative MP, they're not going to support the initiative to withdraw the right to buy. And from all the feedback we've gotten based on this research, majority felt something needs to be done about the right to buy. Even Shelters written quite a lot about right to buy and the impact of right to buy on the housing stock. They need to stop it. I think to do that, we need an effective policy to do that. So if the Labour government are willing to do that, I think that they should introduce that initiative, particularly in England. In Scotland, right to buy is not something that is still in existence. They stopped it. So you can't go and just buy some of the council houses in Scotland. You can't, because you don't have such initiative. Even in Wales, the same thing. But in England, it's something that is creating a lot of challenge. And the problem is not the fact that they are selling those properties. The problem is the fact that they are not reinvesting the receipt from those sales. So even if they are selling them, they are reinvesting them. We won't be talking about the depletion in housing stock. So, yeah.
I think with the right to buy, yes, they are selling and they are not replacing. But one of the things we also saw was in the sale of those houses, like you rightly said, a lot of them end up in the hands of private landlords. And so this a lot of those landlords become rogue landlords. They rent out, and the conditions in those places deteriorate significantly. So it has significant impacts for community cohesion and for stigma also, of those estates. But also, we found that people who buy their own houses turn around and stigmatize the ones who remain council tenants. So there are a lot of things wrong with that policy, and yes, I think it needs to be withdrawn. Yes, there was a lot more accountability to tenants with the council. Some of that has been lost. A lot of it has been lost, in moving them to housing associations. And so we need, in addition to say, how do we get councils building and reintroducing those kind of accountability measures, we also need to think about how do we make the housing associations more and more accountable. And I think both have to go, hand in hand.
Yeah, Sheila.
Yeah, thank you very much. There's a lot to think about. There are a few things that you said that I hadn't come across. I hadn't come across the guide, Fair Press for Tenants guide. Very interesting. But I just wanted to make a few comments, and then I've got a question. First of all, on the right to buy, it will be Labour policy to get rid of the right to buy. It's just at the moment there's a debate about whether you are explicit and say the right to buy will be abolished, whether you say it will only exist where councils don't have a need for social housing, which of course means it wouldn't exist anywhere really. Whether you just get rid of the discounts, and that would have the effect of ending the right to buy without legally ending it and ruling it out. One way or another, I do believe the next Labour government will make the right to buy a thing of the past. And also the Labour Party has already said very loud and clear that it will be funding the building of council housing. And we need to be very clear to the public when we're on the doorstep saying that it was the Tories who put a moratorium on it and removed the funding and removed the right of council to use most of the money from the right to buy for anything related to building housing. So we need to tell people that. It's very interesting talking about the tenant voice at local and national level. At national level, of course, the Labour government set up a national body, which was abolished within weeks, I think, of the coalition government coming in 2010. So we don't need to rethink how to do it. We've got all of those systems set up, very, very well developed, and with our own Steve Hilditch from Labour Housing Group was the professional support to the body that was setting it up to develop it. So we know that it stemmed from the right values that we would all agree with. But all of that needs to come back in at local level as well. And we used to have a system of having board tenants as board members on all housing associations, and I just don't understand why that went. So again, that needs to just come back. On housing as a human right, there certainly is no discussion within the government and its agencies about this, but there certainly is within the Labour Party. It was in last year's housing policy passed at conference, led by Labour Housing Group, and we're leading the campaign within the Labour Party to have housing recognised as a human right within the legislation in England. And we're working with the Scottish and Welsh campaigns on that. We've got an event with them in a few weeks' time with people from both groups. So it's a really exciting time for that. And you put it so well in what you said about why that's so important. So thank you, because I think that will help strengthen our point. And my question is, when you talked about the role of the media, did you mean just in terms of the media talking about factual issues to do with social housing, or the role of the media in fictional representation? Because it's the fictional representation that drives me bonkers. You cannot see a crime series without there being representation of social housing tenants and social housing itself as the absolute pits. They never show really great social housing in so many films, and I think that really has to change. But I wondered if what you meant and what people talked about within your surveys on that point.
I think in terms of the media, I think it's both. I think it's any kind of media representation of social housing. Yes, the factual news media and all of that. But in addition, the kind of programs, I mean, we talked about Benefit Streets, there are other kind of media representations of social housing. So it is the whole spectrum of it, which, and I think in a sense, the Fair Press Guide starts to talk to some of that. I think Mercy's put the link on the chat board. Just to pick up on two of your comments, one around having tenants on boards. While it's a good idea to have tenants on boards, what we found in our study was when the tenants come on the board, one of the first things they are told is, well, you're on the board of this housing association now, you need to remove your tenant hats. You need to work in the interest of the housing association and not put the tenant views across here. So while we are saying, yes, put them on boards, we need to be careful about what we are saying and think more deeply about how that will work. The second thing is the tenant voice. Yes, there was the national tenant voice, which was being established and which, with the 2010 government, was scrapped. We did speak with a couple of people who were involved in that initiative. And I think, again, the point to see, the government could scrap it because the government was going to fund it and it was going to be, government supported and all of that. And I think that's part of what we're saying, whatever comes out as a national tenant voice needs to be something independent, autonomous, have its own life, have its own source of funding, independent of government funding. So, we cannot, the government wouldn't come up there and say, well, we're scrapping the National Housing Federation. It's not, under their control in that sense. So we need to build something for the tenants like that, which, it's outside that kind of control. So again, I think a bit more thought needs to go into you know, what it would be and how it would look like?
Yeah, I think in relation to the National Tenant Voice, I remember there was a conversation we had with staff at the department for leveling up, and they were like, they've established this tenant panel. To them, that is the tenant voice, the tenant body. But what we also observe is their remit is restricted. They can't really engage in a lot of things, and they don't really have the power to do a lot of things. And if we are talking about having a national tenant voice, they need to have the power to influence policies. They need to be given the power to speak on behalf of the tenant. And they need to have the power to influence policy at the central level and even at the local level. I think that is what we need to be advocating for.
Thank you. So, Selma, I'm hoping you're still active on the call, because you gave an excellent presentation at our policy day, I think last Saturday or maybe the Saturday before, about some deep research you did with council tenants in Birmingham. So I'm hoping...
Yeah, hi Andy, I'm still here. Yeah, and I've been listening.
Brilliant. Could you just jump in and talk about that, please?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's fascinating what Mercy and Amanze have been talking about. Yeah, I know this is specifically on social housing, but I think when we did the listening campaign, we had about 340 people that came to us. And again, similar to what this research showed, you know, they had to answer a series of questions. And absolutely underlying all of this is this stigma attached to social housing. Now, don't forget, a lot of people who were speaking with us were in temporary accommodation, so they were homeless. Some of them were in social housing, some of them were in housing associations, some of them were private tenants. And what became glaringly obvious is this accountability, that we need to make sure that there's something in place that holds landlords and the council, really, especially when it comes to social housing, accountable when they're not providing the right or the adequate kind of housing for people, even people who are being housed temporarily. That was the first thing. And the second thing is the communication with tenants. There just doesn't seem to be enough from what our experience from our campaign. There doesn't seem to be enough. And if there are, it's almost just a bit like kind of ticking a box. Yes, we've had a tenants meeting, but not actually followed through on the requests or the concerns raised. I mean, I too myself, as Kerry mentioned, I think it's Kerry Barker, grew up in a council home, and back then in the 70s, it was, you know, it's quite common for lots of people to be in a council home. But now, obviously, with the right to buy, that's already been mentioned, that becomes more and more difficult. And the most obvious way that we have, that is the glaring obvious fact, is that there just needs to be more social housing built. It's simple as that. More money needs to be put in, more, not giving out to private contractors to build all these expensive houses. And the other thing I just wanted to kind of bring up is this whole gentrification of areas. So kind of driving out people who have probably lived in those areas all their lives and suddenly aren't able to afford to stay in those areas because of this notion that an area needs to be improved. And by that, I mean the housing, the social housing isn't like focused on. It's the private housing, it's the ownership that is looked at. And I think that was mentioned in the actual presentation as well, this whole idea that we have to own our own houses. Whereas really, it's all about, I mean, even within the fair housing campaign, our main aim is for it to be a human right. This whole idea of people have a secure, safe and affordable home should be a human right. It's really frustrating actually, because I think I've seen this research that Mercy and Amanze have presented to us, and we've done this campaign and this listening exercise in Birmingham, and it's the same kind of comments that are being made. And I really hope that, you know, Labour and their housing policy take all of this into account, because otherwise it's just lip service, isn't it? And I really feel that that's not fair, it's not right, and it's not the way to move forward when it comes to social housing.
Yeah, brilliantly put, Selma. Mercy, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, thank you, Selma, for your feedback. I mean, the issue around communication with tenants is something that we also picked up from the initial report and also in the consultation, and we specifically made mention of that because the majority of the tenants that we spoke to felt that they were not being listened to, and to address that problem, there needs to be clear lines of accountability and clear lines of communication. And they also talked about the disconnect between the board, the management team, and the housing provider and the tenant, that most times they don't know what's going on within that space. They don't have like a direct line of communication with them. So they only depend on information provided by the housing professionals, and most times those informations are either not accurate or they are not complete. Not that they are not providing information, it's that they are not accurate information or they are not complete information. And if they are provided with incomplete information, there's little they can do about that. And to address that problem, what we recommended is for housing management to be involved with their tenant forum, to go to their tenant forum, to engage more with tenants, to understand the issues from the grassroots level, rather than wait for the housing professionals to provide incomplete records. And also what we also recommended was for the management team to just go on planned visits to their estates where they operate, and just go and observe and knock on people's doors, speak to them and get feedback. And probably that will help them to build trust and also build accountability.
Yeah, no, I also want to say thank you, and I agree with all of what you said, Mercy. And I think the other thing, that stigma attached to social housing is what they look like. Why is it that social housing, when they're built, they do look cheap, they do look like they've just been, you know, really quickly built, and they don't bring that sense of I don't think it's respectful to the people who are living in those properties when the social housing that is built looks completely different to other properties in the area. I'm not saying that everything needs to look completely identical, because I'm also against that as well, but it needs to have some, you know, some level of care and compassion and respect put into the thought of the design of social housing. And I think that in itself affects people when it comes to this whole idea of the stigma around social housing.
Yeah, I think just picking up on your points with, I mean, we've been into a housing development where, you know, what the builder said was, look, the houses with social housing, the social housing houses you can identify, because instead of a block paving in front, they have tarmac. So they stand out, and once you can identify, you can stigmatize. So there's a lot which needs to be done around the construction, especially with the mixed tenure estates. I mean, if you drive it, you know, to its kind of stretching points, you get to things like the poor doors in London, where you have segregated spaces and social housing, there are no play spaces, or, you know, so it's a problem which needs to be addressed. With communication, I think again it's something we need to be careful with, because what we've seen is a number of housing associations say, well, it's a communication problem, and so we'll focus on communication. The problem is broader than just communication. Communication is one element. We've seen other housing associations say, look, it's, you know, it's a training issue, and so we'll give them more training, we'll build it into our EDI training and all of that. So I think a lot of these are symptomatic things, but they are deeper rooted problems which need to be addressed. And as the deeper rooted problems are addressed, the more symptomatic issues will start to be sorted out.
So I'm conscious that Philip, Ezra and Janet have listened to this kind of really politely. Any comments, any thoughts?
Yeah, yeah, if I could go for, yeah, I really agree with the thrust of the report, and obviously be involved with local housing. As a council, I do recognise all the issues that we have identified. We started in Harrow to tackle some of that because we had a change of housing director, and that director worked in all forms of tenancy rather than you normally get the ones that just worked in social housing. So he was quite keen, and I was, particularly around after the pandemic, to re-engage with our tenants, as it were, because I felt we lost a lot of engagement. We stopped having physical meetings, physical get-togethers, and the way in which we started doing that was actually trying to have more conversations online or making specific online offers to particular areas within Harrow. And that's sort of like a very early stage. I've yet to see or the outcome of that, but that was certainly it. And also to have a lot more where he was doing regeneration projects, bring in outside players, such as other support for those tenants, as well as the normal support given by council houses. But I do agree that I think the other major point, and I've had an email today from the Labour campaign for housing, we do need to, in England, push this point about the Labour Party really does need to say we're going to end the right to buy. I know Sheila's talked about if we get rid of the discount, then the right to buy will probably decrease, but I think we need to be firm about this because councils, and I've just read a London Assembly's report about monitoring the housing that the mayor's built or affordable housing. Now there's record numbers of affordable housing being built across London, as it were. So we need to be clear that we, or the Labour Party does, and this returns to stigma, that we're going to end the right to buy. Now, we know that the Conservative government are trying to re-resurrect this right to buy for housing associations. They had the pilot in Midlands, I think, and that didn't prove successful, but I still think, again, I think the report is right. I think the Labour Party started as well. They start talking up, or more talking up, home ownership rather than or having the correct type of tenure or the standards across tenure. I think that's where we're right in saying any form of housing is that human right, as it were. Now, whether it's ownership, there's a lot of private owners in Harrow, and quite a lot of them are quite elderly. They're living just as poor conditions as social housing or the housing associations. So it does cut across. And when we talk about that, that's where we need to bring that conversation. We're not just talking about social housing. We're talking about those old owner-occupiers, those people who are in temporary accommodation for years and years, placed by local authorities because we haven't built or been able to build that replacement council housing. So I think with this conversation is a very good start around that, but it gives a lot of us in the Labour housing group to campaign on a regional and national level to get that sort of message across to those people who are empowered, the actual members of cabinet in London housing authorities, and those who have influence, because they should also have a growing influence on those housing associations, because we're relying on more and more on them delivering that type of affordable housing. Thanks.
Yeah, I don't know if you noticed, Phillips, but you got a thumbs up from Selma in Birmingham. So Ezra, Jenna, any thoughts, any comments you want to add? Not compulsory.
happy just to listen and learn and have done. So thanks.
Okay, thanks, Janet.
Well, I think it's really good to be having these conversations, isn't it? It's I think the tenants' voice at local level and national level. It was with the National Tenants' Voice and the Tenant Services Authority a few years ago. It seemed that it was actually going up, and then it's I think it's decreased, and it's such a shame because it's imperative that there is that voice. One question is, I don't know whether there's something about in terms of the social housing regulation bill, there seems to be very much an emphasis on tenants as consumers. And I wonder whether, you know, or as an alternative, is there a way of seeing tenants as citizens that so they're involved as partners rather than as clients?
Janet, that's a brilliant question to finish with. So Mercy, amazing.
I think, thanks, Jonathan. I think that's one of the things which we've been saying. Right now, in terms of regulation of the social housing space, you have a co-regulatory arrangement between the regulator and the landlords, and the tenant is absent from that co-regulatory regime, and we need to put the tenants back in there, and they need to be involved in regulation and governance of the sector. And I think, yes, part of that would refocus interest on, or refocus on the interest of the tenants. And we start to see the tenants as a major player in the sector. We start to see them no longer as consumers, but as partners in this, who have a stake, and a significant stake at that, in the sector.
Yeah, I agree with you. Currently, the tenants are seen as the others. And I think in our written evidence to the social housing regulation, what's it called, consultation last year, we also made mention of that we need to have a proactive regulatory space where the tenants can be part of the regulatory framework, because currently they are not part of the regulatory framework. That's why they are seen as the consumer and not the citizens, or not the stakeholders or the partners. So we need to have that arrangement change, that tenants can be part of the regulatory space. I think if they are part of the regulatory space, they should be able to influence the conversation. They should be able to have the power to speak on behalf of themselves and on behalf of others within that space.
So Mercy, a final question. So you dropped into the conversation that you've been talking to MPs and obviously trying to influence people. What's the next steps for your report? How do you hope it's going to get picked up both by Labour? Well, particularly talk to how you'd like Labour to pick it up, because that's kind of where we've got influence.
In terms of Labour, what we would like to see is adoption of the idea of housing as a right, and I can see the housing group has made some progress in that kind of space. But when we start to center policy around housing as a right, then we start to think about things like supply, making sure that everybody has some decent accommodation. That would, like Philip said, it would need to be a mix of tenures. So it's not so much that we will not have homeowners or, everybody going to social housing, but it needs to be seen as a valid part of the housing mix. So I think policy needs to be directed in that kind of thrust. We would like to see significant changes to the regulatory, to the regulation of social housing. Yes, the kind of social housing bill which is going through Parliament has some changes in terms of proactive regulation of the consumer standards, but I think it needs to go much further. Like we said, we need to see tenants involved in creating regulation, in deciding what service standards would be, how those standards are met, if those standards have been met, and what kind of regulatory sanctions if they need to be issued. So stronger input of the tenant in regulation, and the tenant voice wants to see a strong tenant voice. So I think in terms of Labour carrying that forward and going into policy. Yeah.
Yeah, I think basically what Amanze is trying to say is that the Labour Party should adopt or implement our recommendation, particularly the recommendation proposed in the consultation report. We outlined several consultation recommendation around the 7 questions. So if you can look into that and adopt or implement that, that would be great. And we feel that will make a huge difference to the housing sector. And also around tenant voice, I think it's something that we need to keep advocating for. The tenant, they feel there needs to be a national tenant body that will speak for them. So if the Labour Party can do that, I'm sure a lot of people will welcome that. And also the right to buy withdrawal. I think if the Labour Party can do that, a lot of people will welcome that. I know Shelter will welcome that. So thanks.
Thank you. Well, I think you've convinced the 7 Labour Party members on the call that the great thing about having smaller numbers is that you've just given us an absolute kind of masterclass seminar. So thank you for that. I get the impression that most of us have read your report, but if anybody hasn't, it's there, it's available online, and it's free. Also, you're going to be writing a red brick blog for us as well, aren't you?
Yeah, I think we've done that already. So
yeah, okay, and soon to be published, Sheila. Okay, yeah, that's brilliant. So can I thank everyone for joining us? We haven't got any more in conversations lined up yet, but look out for future ones. And yeah, thanks everyone for a really good contribution and making this a really stimulating seminar.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Amanze. Thank you.
Okay,
thank
you.
Sheila. Bye-bye.
bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.